Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's CECAN webinar. My name is Gail, and I'm one of the CECAN Centre Managers. We're delighted to have Bridget Dillon with us today. Bridget is Head of Evaluation Profession at the Department for International Development, UK Government. Bridget is going to speak to us for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. Please do submit your questions at any point via the question box, which you should be able to see on the Zoom control panel. The session will be recorded and will later be made available on the CECAN website along with the slides. I will now hand over to Bridget for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Gail. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Bridget Dillon. I am Head of the Evaluation Profession at the Department for International Development, or DFID, in the UK Government. My focus today is a practitioner's insights on theory of change, or as I will abbreviate it, TOC. As you all know, there are plenty of instruction manuals and examples, indeed lots written about TOC. I list a few of these at the end of the presentation. This notwithstanding, there is a prevailing view that the practice of what TOC comprises, that is, how it is depicted and how it is used, remains much understood. In addition to this, TOC as a tool has evolved and is still evolving, since it has increasingly taken a central role in intervention design and evaluation over the past decade and more. This also means that there is no one settled view on TOC. Set against this background, today's webinar is not an A to Z of how to do TOC. It is pitched at those who have some knowledge of TOC already. The webinar provides insights from the point of view of an active practitioner, that is a commissioner, an intervention manager, and/or evaluator, in this case, operating in the donor community in the field of international development. These insights are significantly informed by John Mayne's work, reference his work mainly in 2015, but he has contributed others. He is a Canadian thought leader on evaluation, and the insights are also drawn from experience of both developing and quality assuring theories of change in DFID, the European Commission, and a range of agencies over the past decade. To note, in DFID, theory of change is core to intervention design and evaluation. Strengthening capability in theory of change across the organization continues as work in progress as we build on our own experience and integrate what we learn from others. Okay. The agenda for this webinar includes opening slides on what people often say about theory of change, or frequently heard observations, a brief look at benefits and origins of theory of change, this is often overlooked, and insights into getting the most out of theory of change based around the frequent observations. So, first, here are a number of frequent things people say about theory of change. It's just a mix of boxes and arrows. It is a single theory. It's a diagram on one side of an A4 sheet of paper. It takes a lot of time and resources, which we don't have. You have to develop a theory of change to get funds, and then you can put it away. In fact, you can just leave it. So all these observations, whether they are valid or not, they have one thing in common. They miss the point. And And the point is that theory of change is versatile, meaningful, testable, multi-purpose, and therefore, applied appropriately, it is one of the most useful tools an intervention designer or an evaluator can have. So let's take a closer look at the practical benefits of the theory of change. It's versatile, meaningful, multi-purpose. Okay, a versatile tool in that it applies in all contexts and situations, whether large, small, fragile, stable, complicated, complex. It's meaningful in that it builds, it's in tune with reality. It builds shared understanding, and it is testable. You can actually measure change with it. It is multi-purpose. It has a range of specific uses which are set out in various of the guides. For example, designing an intervention, understanding how change is likely to happen, revealing, positioning the intervention in a robust understanding of its context. It's important for managing an intervention to be able to adjust direction, activities, and pace. It's not just pace, sorry, sequence. It's good at enabling learning, informing, monitoring, and evaluation, and provides opportunity for identifying unintended effects, and it can integrate new developments. It's also useful for assessing interventions. It points to areas of strength or weaknesses in a causal chain, and therefore where evaluation could be used to generate further data or information. And it helps to make causal claims about impact. And finally, scaling. It helps to replicate to the intervention to other locations, or to assess whether you can do that, and to scale up. So this range makes theory of change a useful, indeed a powerful design and evaluation tool. But from what they say, there are people out there who are clearly not getting the most out of TOC. Okay, let's start our insights by looking at where TOC has come from. Origins of TOC. I imagine that most people listening to this webinar were brought up, so to speak, on the log frame matrix, the LFM. Donor agencies in the field of international development have long used the LFM to justify and monitor interventions and investment decisions. The LFM has undoubtedly made a great contribution to measuring development interventions and continues to do so. However, with hindsight, its early ambitions were arguably overly high. Over the years, but particularly since the mid-1990s, there has been increasing recognition by evaluators and commissioners of evaluations that in dealing with complex social change programs and in international development, these can be large, innovative interventions in fragile situations and difficult operating environments. In dealing with complex programs, it is often not clear exactly what the interventions seek to do, and this in turn makes it difficult to know whether or how the interventions have achieved their goals. Such consistent recognition implies that there must be something missing in the way intervention designers and evaluators are thinking or doing, or indeed both. This particular cartoon has become a regular part of discussions and presentations about theory of change. Indeed, when some people now see this cartoon, they think theory of change. It symbolizes the gap in the way we think, understand, or explain what is happening or unfolding in an intervention, or the gap in the link between cause and effect. That something is missing were views also expounded, particularly by key US evaluation thought leaders. For example, Chen, Patton, and Weiss in the 1990s. And the discussion continues today. We certainly need to get a handle on the causal pathway. One of the key thought leaders, Carol H. Weiss, developed a conceptual framework to address the gap. She popularized the term theory of change to describe the set of assumptions which explain both the hypothesis, the pathway underpinning the set of changes the stakeholders envisage happening to deliver long-term goal. That's the hypothesis of how change will happen, sometimes called the impact pathway or the program theory. And the mechanisms which transform one change or one step of change into another step change along the way. This is often referred to as the theory of action, which is usually set out in the log frame matrix. It's important to note two things here. One, theory. Theory in Weiss's sense is not some highfalutin thing, but rather a setting out of how change happens. It's a pathway which links cause and effect. And another thing, whilst theory of change most often is used to refer to the hypothesis underpinning the change process, what we have up on the screen as A, confusingly, the collective name for these two together, that is A and B, i.e. the hypothesis of change process and the mechanisms which transform one change into another, is also called theory of change. So if you have been confused in the past, you may not be alone, but hopefully this will go some way to helping you resolve your confusion. Still on the concept or the conceptual framework of theory of change, here's another and perhaps a more accessible and memorable way of expressing it from another evaluation thought leader, Hui, I'm not sure if I say his name right, T. Chen. He determines this as the why question. Why does the intervention affect the outcomes? That's the change model. And the how question. How are the contextual factors and intervention activities organized for implementing the intervention and supporting the change process? This is the action model. So, having looked at the benefits, the origins, and a bit of the gap TOC seeks to fill, let's now turn to some insights prompted by the frequently heard observations. Observation 1. TOC is just a mix of boxes and arrows. This observation underestimates the breadth and depth of theory of change and therefore its full value as a tool in design and evaluation. TOC is not simply a product, but an important and necessary thinking process. Some would argue the process is worth even more than the product. TOC involves creating space and convening the appropriate stakeholders, including key influencers, beneficiaries, to discuss their understanding and perspectives and expectations of intervening. Building a shared understanding over time of the issue to be addressed, the context, and getting an understanding of how change will happen based on evidenced assumptions and how a given intervention will address it. This is quite some process. I mentioned that it's about building a shared understanding over time. Just a word about shared. Shared does not necessarily mean consensus. This is really crucial to grasp. It means all involved know the views of everyone else. It is, of course, helpful if there is a consensus, but different stakeholders are much more likely to hold different emphases and priorities. These are exactly what needs to be revealed and made explicit through the theory of change development process. These views are crucial to know as they contribute critically to the shape and the direction of the intervention going forward. A bit more on this later. I'd like to give, we've said that, you know, the TOC is important and necessary. I'd just like to give an example. So let's see what happens when the initial theory of change process is inadequate. Either it doesn't, a theory of change isn't developed at all, or the process is not as inclusive as the subject of the intervention demands. And I'll give you an example of a long time ago, when I was involved in developing for DFID the Southern Africa Regional Poverty Network, the CECAN. This was a platform for public policy debate on poverty in the Southern Africa region. The assumption that we made was that seminars, and this is a good 15, 20 years ago, the assumption was that seminars with physical presence and face-to-face of public speakers and audience on key poverty issues would raise awareness and influence debate, which in turn would influence policy. It was an innovative intervention in the region at the time. It was low cost and high profile intervention. And the results were that whilst the physical seminars were a significant success and took a huge amount of time and effort to organize, it was actually the CECAN website which absolutely took off. Huge numbers of website hits in a very short time were recorded, not just nationally and regionally, but internationally. Whilst in 2019, that may not be surprising, at the turn of the century, we weren't quite as prepared. In the process of developing the theory of change, we had not incorporated the digital dimension, and indeed not therefore included the notion of wider reach of the intervention. Bit of a glaring gap, you might say. And which challenged the level of ambition we originally had for the intervention. If we had incorporated the internet as part of the theory of change process and thinking, the shape of the intervention would have had a different balance and a different cost structure and reach right from the start. Moving to another insight. Theory of change focuses on how change happens and the assumptions which underpin each step of the process of change. So, taking the frequently made observation at face value, there are other commonly used design and evaluation tools with boxes and arrows. It is, in fact, quite a crowded field. So where does TOC fit with these? Let's look at a few of these tools. First up, here's a results chain. A results chain is set out in prescribed format. Yes, a set of boxes and arrows, and is useful to provide or highlight inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact, results in any given intervention. The results chain in itself provides no context, no rationale, no identification of change processes. Donors and partners like it for its simple, easy to read snapshot form. It derives from the log frame matrix, the LFM. Here then is the LFM. It sets out in prescribed format boxes with a direction, much more than a results chain. It offers the connections between the intervention goals and its activities. It offers indicators for monitoring. However, it does not address change processes. Assumptions are articulated against results chain, but not for mini steps of the change process, and evidence is not included, nor detailed reach, i.e. whom is affected at what stage. The LFM is a useful tool for monitoring progress of the intervention within its objectives and purpose and expected outputs. etc., by means of indicators and milestones. It works best, as we all know, in sectors and contexts with readily measurable indicators. It provides the theory of action. Theory of change is essentially a higher order tool than either the results chain or the log frame matrix. It focuses on how stakeholders think change will happen to deliver long-term goals and why. I will repeat that. It focuses on how stakeholders think change will happen to deliver long-term goals and why. It makes assumptions explicit for the overall intervention and for every step of the change process. It identifies the strength of evidence of those assumptions. It does not have a prescribed format. How do these tools fit together? Well, I would suggest that the TOC, the pitch, it has the bigger picture, it's higher level, it has more strategic overview of the change process. The LFM is actively used to monitor the action, and the RC focuses on results to be delivered. All three tools are useful in their own right. They are designed for different purposes. To get the most out of the theory of change, we should recognize these distinctions and their respective values and uses, and the relationship of each tool to each other. Do not try to conflate one tool with another, thereby rendering each much less use to your inquiry, learning, and reporting. Some of you may be asking, what about systems analysis? Another tool with boxes and arrows. And what about political economy analysis, institutional analysis? Where do these fit? Broadly, these fit into the context thinking and subsequently relevant parts of the unfolding change process in the theory of change. However, we're not going to dwell on this, as this is a topic for another webinar. I just want to signal that we have not forgotten them. A word about sequence in developing a theory of change. In the sequence of developing or designing an intervention, theory of change is the place or the tool to start with, as the log frame matrix and the results chain derive from it. This goes against the trend in a way. The log frame matrix has been around longer time, and many people see log frame matrix as the natural starting point. You may have come across many situations where people try to build a theory of change from a log frame. Of course you can do this, but you risk not getting the most value out of the theory of change, as you start from a restricting results-ordered view, inputs, outputs, outcomes, impact, which constrains you when you need to be thinking about how change happens and derive from that the best way to intervene. Let's move to the next insight. This may sound odd when I have just said there is no prescribed format for a theory of change. This is true. However, there are some aids or models which help to provoke thinking and reflection about change, which you can add to and customize. There is no prescription. Whether there's no prescription or not, theories of change are commonly, and you will recognize this, depicted by an outcome-based model. And here is one on your screen. It is a model which tells a story around the results chain. However, what we really seek is the story around how change unfolds. And I would suggest that there are other models which lend greater meaning. For example, actor-based and behavior change models that can be used. So let's just consider the generic behavior change model set out by John Mayne. This is a model for thinking through how change happens. And I think it's really useful because, and there's quite a number of issues here, the change process that is, the theory or the hypothesis or the pathway of change, is based on behaviour change from start to final delivery. This is pertinent to the international development operating environment, where behaviour change is often a key part of the overall change sought. It is useful because assumptions are prominent. There, if you can see there's a little arrow coming up here. These blue boxes have different types of assumptions, and they are given real space. If you put key assumptions at each level of change, not just the overarching level, right at the top, but at each level of change, this is useful. Then you can test whether they remain valid as implementation develops, and hence know whether you need to adjust the intervention or continue as planned. Please note also that there are different types. I think I've mentioned those. You've got reach assumptions, capacity change, behaviour change, direct benefits, and the broader well-being change assumptions. Let's just look at reach for a moment. Reach is about who or what is affected and at what point in the change process. This is useful as it brings the theory of change alive and provides greater meaning to understanding change. After all, people are at the heart of this. The reach element tends to be either missing or very much in the backwater in log frame work, but in this model, it's prized. Feedback loops. Do you see the arrows and the arrows going backwards and forwards? This is crucial in any theory of change. People from all parts of the intervention and outside it will offer views throughout the implementation of the intervention. And you need to listen out and hear them and incorporate as necessary and adjust assumptions and activities. Theory of change is challenged by many as being a rather linear process. Feedback loops are a key mechanism for addressing this. And then there is the timeline. Look over to the left here. Timeline relates to the development of the intervention, not the donor timetable for accountability related to donor cycles of management. That's a significant difference. And then you have here external influences, external factors included. That's around context and, of course, space for unanticipated results. That is mostly what I've already said. So now I think we can get even more out of this model, and I'm going to give you some suggestions. So at the start of the model, it did not provide for rationale for intervening, but there's nothing to stop you putting it there. I think the rationale for intervening in the first place, why is it considered necessary to intervene? Who intervenes? Which donor or private sector or government or whoever, and in what way or what type of intervention. These are really crucial. They add the dimension of positioning the change process, which is crucial for how the intervention will shape over time, and provides valuable baseline information for assessment during evaluation. You can also show, you saw there was a space for reach right early on, but you can show reach at different points along the way. Those reached may change. In a mother and child program, maybe you reach the, well, you will reach the mothers first and then the children later on. Okay, so get them spaced out there. And maybe the children take on more importance later on than the mothers in the process of change. So it's critical to understanding who or what institution is affected to manage the intervention and for subsequent evaluation. And then there is assessment of quality of evidence, which underpins each assumption. The added value here points to where evidence was weak or strong and where further evidence could helpfully be generated through evaluative exercises. So in the original, whoops, let's just go back very briefly. You see, you can put the rationale either over here or somewhere certainly before the activities. You can have reach not just at here, but at further up as well. And you can, under each assumption, you can have the assessment of the quality of evidence that informs those assumptions. Okay, so recap. Observation, just a mix of boxes and arrows? No, disagree. TOC is a necessary thinking process. It's about how change unfolds and the assumptions which underpin that. And why not try a useful theory of change model? Okay, let's go to observation 2. Theory of change is a single theory. This is an understandable misconception. The concept of theory of change is expressed in the singular, which has given rise to the belief that there is only a single theory of change applicable in a given context or situation. Let's consider this. Each theory of change is a story of change with as many perspectives on that story as there are stakeholders or stakeholder groups. So, whose story, and therefore whose theory of change is it? To illustrate what I mean, a recent exercise in DFID about intervening at portfolio level in a country, that means at the level of a whole set of programs which together make an impact on that country, highlighted the importance of determining and clarifying whose change process it is for which a theory of change is being sought. Is it the country's own pathway of change, i.e. how change is unfolding in country X? DFID would be external to that. Or is it the pathway of change which focuses on how DFID intervenes in the country? DFID is a participant in that. Both of these are, of course, valid. However, to get the most out of theory of change, be sure to distinguish and not to mix up the two. Each of these theories of change has different owners and therefore different goals, different reach, and different levels of ambition. Sounds easy here, but takes quite a lot of thought in practice. Now, moving on and taking this point about perspective one step further, to get the most out of using theory of change, we need to recognize that in any intervention, there is an overarching theory of change, which relates to the whole intervention, and a theory or pathway which underpins each discrete change process, which contributes to that whole intervention. Another way of putting this is that there's a theory of change per owner or actor or per component part of a complex intervention. Each has their own perspective on the whole. So rather than a single theory of change, several theories of change should be anticipated, indeed expected, for any given intervention. In practice, this means an overarching theory of change and sub-theories or nested theories of change as they nest under the overarching theory of change. The added value of a separate theory of change for discrete change processes or component parts is that it provides space to make assumptions at that level explicit and facilitates closer assessment of change. Now, if you look at your screen, here's an example from Mayne of a nutrition intervention showing the main pathway and where, this is the main pathway, obviously, and he makes some places where you could develop a nested theory for reach of the mothers. You could expand upon that. You could have a nested theory for reach for the boys and the girls. Here is an example of a nested, of a worked up nested theory of change from the perspective of an NGO partner engaging with the nutrition intervention. In complex interventions, nested theories are useful, not only in the ways we've already said, but for highlighting assumptions around sequence and around dependency of actions. The added value here is that deeper understanding of these can help pinpoint what causes, for example, acceleration or delays, or adds or detracts from the quality of delivery. So we don't just get the issue of, oh, well, the train was late or what have you, or we couldn't bring the supplies because there was nowhere to put them, the sort of what. We can actually get further into understanding what caused some of those delays and why they didn't happen as we had originally expected. So, recap. Okay, the observation of a single theory, you need to determine perspectives of the TOC, and which perspective are you taking, and the TOC comprises really an overarching theory and sub-theories per action or owner or component part, and it helps to highlight the sequence and dependency between intervention components or parts. So it's not really a single theory, it will comprise a lot of other ones too. Okay, observation 3. TOC is is an A4 diagram only. This observation is very common and I think can be very damaging to the value and use of theory of change. Whilst diagrams are important and can enlighten and provide shortcut to large quantities of information, this observation overly focuses on the TOC diagram, i.e. visible product, to the detriment of the value of the overall TOC as a tool. We've already said TOC is just as much a thinking process as a diagram, insight 1, that its nested TOCs render the TOC equals 1 times diagram, only the overarching TOC, and is inadequate for the demands of most complex interventions. We would add that the TOC requires explicit articulation of change processes and assumptions, and this is best in narrative form. We would also add that an A4 diagram restricts thinking and starts from a reductionist viewpoint and forces focus on representation rather than the reality of change on the ground. It is the case that many people who develop a TOC begin the endeavour with a diagram. It is beguiling to do so. And of course you can do so if you want, of course. However, focusing on one sheet and representation of the TOC before thinking through in longhand, if you like, the way change will happen carries risks. And these are focusing on ever perfecting the diagram per se and missing its substance, e.g. the necessary mini steps in the change process and key nuances and consequent assumptions and evidence. It risks missing the focus, the key emphases and priorities of the TOC. You've got so much information, you really got to highlight what are the priorities. It risks missing the sequencing and dependencies of different actors, component parts, and it risks cluttering the A4 sheet with too much information for the reader to understand. And this is a critical risk, leaving no guarantee that each reader will interpret the diagram in the same desired way and consequently jeopardize its use. So just how useful is that? So TOCs need a narrative, or rather narratives. There is much in a pathway of change to explain and nuance, and this is more easily achieved in narrative form. Think of a TOC product as a narrative or narratives with accompanying meaningful diagrams which highlight key aspects of the TOC. I draw from experience of many reviewers who look at draft TOCs, TOC diagrams or draft reports containing TOC diagrams and say that they did not bother really looking at the diagrams as they could not understand them. Think of the hours, the effort, the amount of money which has gone into producing diagrams which are then not read, consequently not used. So if TOC equals 1 times A4 diagram, it will not get optimum use throughout the life of the intervention. Very briefly, this is drawn from Appendix 3, which you can get on the Google, Vogel 2012. This is an example of a very high-level narrative. And what is the matter with narrative? Practitioners are sometimes reluctant to write simple narratives for hypotheses and key assumptions. This example is short. It's around a roads intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You could produce a simple diagram to highlight this, but is it not okay just as it is? Your call. What will be tested over time is the hypothesis and its assumptions. Are they not clearly set out here? Here is an all-encompassing TOC diagram. This can be useful to highlight key messages and depict sequence dependencies of how nested TOCs link together. They are not necessarily the best medium to represent the entirety, nor the complexity, the nuances that you seek to message. Here is the EU evaluation of the partnership instrument 2017, which has been published. Whilst the diagram has a value for its own purpose within the particular evaluation it serves, nobody's knocking that, and very much for those who developed it. If we apply some of the points given above in this discussion, what about its readability and what about ensuring common interpretation? Returning briefly to the DRC roads example, let's look at simple, powerful messaging through visual representation. The hypothesis for the roads intervention in DRC is actually nested in a wider framework, the International Security and Stabilization Support Strategy. This framework considers that road access is the first step towards achieving stabilization outcomes with security, and then restoration of state authority following in sequence. So a framework was developed in WDR 2011, and this suggests repeated cycle of action to bolster institutional resilience and people's confidence. I'm showing you this to illustrate that a simple diagram is effective to highlight key message, not cluttered, easy to read, with high potential for being interpreted the same way by readership. Diagrams for the sake of being diagrams are best avoided. For an excellent guide to representation of theories of change, please have a look at Purposeful Program Theory. Funnell and Rogers quoted are listed at the end of this presentation, also at the end. So, recap, TOC is really about a narrative or narratives with meaningful or accompanying meaningful diagrams, and diagrams are best used to communicate key messages. Observation 4, TOC, you'll have heard a lot of this one. TOC takes a lot of time and resources, which we do not have. Let's look at this. I'm a bit concerned here. A lot of development people say we've no time nor the resources, but there is time and resources to do things which may be less useful. Let's step back. In international development, donors are guests invited to intervene in another territory using their own taxpayers' funds or charity funds or whatever, to better the lives of poor people in those countries. We have an actual responsibility that when we intervene, it will be beneficial to those it is meant to assist. This is not value-free experimentation, it is responsible engagement. Sometimes we lose sight of this responsibility whilst focusing so much on the paperwork. To get the most out of theory of change, consider it as a useful, indeed powerful tool, not as an element in a set of procedures which need to be completed. So, you say, well, that's fine, that's great, yes, I'll try and do that, but I'm still not incentivized with time and resources. Okay, let's look to what is within our remit, and that is to shift to working smart. Time is catching up on me, so I'm going to pick a few things here. Many people feel overwhelmed when confronted with developing a theory of change, not surprisingly, as it involves bringing together a range of people with different vested interests and forging a way forward. You need to handle contestation. So to get the most out of it, think ahead about facilitation of the process and where to focus. Some suggestions on planning. Frame the overall TOC development process into doable parts within the timeline and with clear product share the plan with stakeholders, prevent the sense of never-ending discussion with uncertain conclusions. Focus on developing the story of change. Bring out the story of how change will happen from each stakeholder's perspective. Don't get into the details of theory of change and the jargon, unless people want it, nor explaining the technical details and the mystics, which that's what they feel. Just ask stakeholders to tell you about how they think it will happen, it will unfold, and identify if this will be done through advocacy, service delivery, education, capacity building, or how. Articulate the issue to be addressed precisely and identify those issues, whose issue it is, and whether it's a government, what part does government play in this, what part does the donor play. This is really important. It may not be equally shared, it may be carved up in a different way. Give emphasis to context in which the issue to be addressed and the change to be brought about will fit. Key players who have significant impact on the momentum of the intervention are often underexplored. Include rationale for intervening. I've spoken about this before, so I won't go into detail now. But remember, when an evaluator comes, one of the first things they ask is, what was the rationale for this intervention? Whose idea was it? And why was it a good idea for donor X to intervene and not somebody else? Start with what you want to achieve and work backwards, not with what you want to do. Recall my example of SARPN, the Southern Africa Regional Poverty Network, given earlier. One of our problems was we started with what we wanted to do. We hit upon the idea that it would be a great thing to have a platform where we could have political and commentators and whatever come and talk in Pretoria and reach out to various other commentators. But actually, what we needed to think of was, what did we actually want to achieve, and work backwards from that. And focus on assumptions for the overall intervention and for each step in the change process. Remember, there are killer assumptions. There are assumptions at the different levels, and focus also on the evidence for these assumptions. What level of evidence do you have? These are what you're going to test and evaluate at the end. Do not work alone. This is a huge temptation. It's a great time waster. We all love to do it. Oh, I'll just go and do it and then share it with them. No, 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 no. Yes, plan ahead alone. Think about how you're going to do things, but do not try to develop a theory of change by yourself, as the buy-in from stakeholders is necessary for ownership and use going forward. And actually, the reality is you can't develop a theory of change successfully on your own. It is a joint process. So, insights recap. TOC takes a lot of time and resources, which we do not have. Well, work smart and work together with key stakeholders. Observation 5, develop the theory of change to obtain funds, then leave it. Well, you can imagine what I'm going to say now. What a travesty. As we said earlier, theory of change is only worth doing if you're going to use it. It is actually a living tool. So to get the most out of it, ensure robust ownership. Build ownership through participation. We've already discussed that. And one thing you can do is, when you produce your early products, acknowledge authorship. Put the author's name on. List the participants in the development of the theory of change. What number version of it is it? What's the date? Because actually, you're going to be coming back to this and creating new versions, and you will see the difference between the versions. So these are not binnable. They're absolutely things to be kept, because the use of the TOC is to review and test the assumptions that you had a month or 3 months ago on a regular basis, and to update and create a new version and to show revised assumptions, and then to be able to compare over time how your assumptions have changed. It's key baseline information. Then around evidence, if new evidence has come up, has come to light to underpin any of the assumptions, then it needs to be introduced. And you can use the theory of change, where you've got your evidence in it, to check whether, and you need to update that, and you can use the evaluative exercises to generate evidence where evidence is weak. And finally on this, you know, everybody draws a diagram. We've talked about this, but actually only one diagram is probably not enough. It is in fact inadequate, because for using the theory of change as a communications tool, there are different audiences who need different depths of information. One diagram, if you like, is for the stakeholders, those who are involved in developing it. And those are the diagrams that we tend to see, and they tend to be absolutely, you know, with lots of stuff on them and perhaps unreadable for some people. That's the one we tend to see. But it's very difficult for those who are not involved to read it and absorb it. So do another one, less easier to read, for the steering group to manage, so just lifting out some of the main things, and then one for external communication about the intervention, high-level changes and assumptions about the intervention. And you may say, oh my goodness, we haven't got time to do all this. I'm not convinced. I'm not sure that you've got time only to do one of them, because actually that might end up, if you just use the top one, confusing people. What you've got an interest in doing is to not confuse people. So any way that you can visualize things that will help people to understand better is rather helpful. Okay, recap. So observation, develop the theory of change to obtain funds and then leave it in a drawer and forget it. No, I wouldn't agree with that. Use the theory of change to test assumptions, to update and adjust the course of implementation as necessary. Use the theory of change to assess what evidence is needed and whether that evidence base is changing, and use it to use evaluation or evaluative exercise to generate information, and use the theory of change to communicate the intervention. Now, time is running out. I can go on and interrogate a few examples, but that will probably take us to 2 o'clock, and I don't know if there are people who would rather we had questions and would like to ask. So I'm open to whichever way.
How about if we carry on till 2 o'clock? If anyone has any burning questions, please could you email us at cecan@surrey.ac.uk. That's cecan@surrey.ac.uk. And then we can pass those on to Bridget after the webinar.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. So I've got a few examples here. It is ironic that we're looking at diagrams, and I've made a lot of noise about narratives, but in terms of webinar, I'm afraid looking at diagrams is easier. And anyway, it's quite good to learn from. So here, don't worry, you don't have to read all this. What you have to look at is the shape. These two go together. So that's why I'm showing you both. Oh, there we go, both at once. This is a draft intervention design, theory of change from some years back, with which I was involved with some colleagues. It's about using a network, or actually setting up a network of evaluation focal points, that's staff, across an agency in HQ and overseas, to promote better skills, evaluation skills, and in turn better quality evaluations, and in turn better use of evaluations. It represented a step forward at the time. I and others involved have learned quite a lot since. There's a lot that's really positive about this. It's concise, it sticks to salient points, it's a real good capture of key things, it's easy to read left to right. However, on reflection, and that's after a number of years with hindsight, is the context, rationale, overall intervention assumptions best in diagram form? I think that's arguable. Are the assumptions, they're over here on the right-hand side, are they testable? I would probably, and the colleagues too, I'm sure, would spend much more time on these now than we did at the time. We just were so keen to elicit some. And on this, it's very much, remember, an outcome-based model. So we are not looking at real-time sequences and dependencies, but idealized. It's a bit closer to a log frame matrix than it perhaps is to a theory of change in hindsight. What is the pathway of change? We just put pathway of change. Actually, at the time, we thought it was capacity building. But actually, when you go back and look at this and you've got time, you will see that capacity building was much too broad a concept of pathway of change. What we were really on about was constituency building. We wanted a network of ambassadors, if you like, in inverted commas, and who would actually preach the business and teach the business of evaluation. So it was much more than just capacity building these people. We wanted them to act in our favor. And that's actually a rather more refined pathway of change. In all, of course, looking back now, we were overly ambitious, weren't we? No time frame provided. The Mayne model, which at the time we were unaware of, would have helped us to see what we could actually expect in the time frame with the resources we had. And it would have focused us much more on reach and unpacking the change that was involved, because there's quite a lot of change in here. I'm sure there are more things to say, but let's move on very quickly. Woohoo. Here is an example of an EU evaluation, theory of change, of the EU evaluation of cooperation in Lesotho. It was published in 2015, but it covers a number of years. I'm not sure, it might have been 5 or a bit more. This example, to be fair on it, is taken out of context, but we're going to say some positive things about it. It has a great focus on assumptions. Just look at the amount of space in the page that they've given on assumptions. Yes, that's where you want to put the emphasis. Perhaps if we unpack the assumptions, perhaps we would like to make them more testable. It includes a timeline, that's really helpful, and it includes a rationale, that's really good. And let's move on to another one. Here is, these of course are reconstructed, these last two are reconstructed theories of change. They were not done in the design time. The first one was a design theory of change. These are reconstructed, and I've had a part in developing some of these, so I take the issues that I'm challenging myself with. The example is, this example is also taken a bit out of its own context to discuss the generic point of the usefulness of the purposes for this webinar. What's positive, I think, about this is less cluttered. It's easier to absorb, okay, maybe arguable. It's positive, it's got a timeline. You can see at the bottom, whoops, there you go, whoa, there. It's a high-level pitch. The assumptions are present, but there isn't really evidence to underpin them, as we've talked about. I'm not sure that everyone will interpret this diagram in the same way, and I'm not sure, again, that the assumptions are testable. Just by repeating and seeing some of the same things on some of the same, just repeating them again and again makes you, I hope, pick up that actually these are things that need to be looked at. Now, very quickly, before I leave, just 2 more slides. I think what all this shows is that you need a balance of outlook and skills. And this is from a conversation with a good friend, Steve Montague, who's a fellow of the Canadian Evaluation Society. Here we have a mechanic, and here we have a gardener. And so while all is said and done, the outlook and skills which help you to get the most out of theory of change are less balanced towards those of the mechanic or the fixer, and although those are useful, and they're more balanced towards those of a gardener or a nurturer. I hope that makes a lot of sense given what I've been saying. Here is a list of key references and resources. Of course, there's plenty more, but if you delve into these, You might find some very useful things. We have, well, a lot has been packed into a short time in this webinar, and I do hope that each of you has found or at least some takeaways to use in your theory of change practice. So finally, thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Bridget. As mentioned, everyone, our apologies for running over slightly. If you do have any questions, please do email those to us at cecan@surrey.ac.uk, and we'll pass them on to Bridget. We will be adding the slides and a recording to our website in the coming days. So thank you all for attending, and thank you very much.